Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something absolutely wild. 3 rulers who completely shattered the rules of their time. We're talking about a Chinese woman who became the only female emperor in history, an African queen who made European colonizers look like absolute amateurs, and a bureaucrat from a civilization so advanced it makes modern city planning look primitive. Forget everything you think you know about ancient history. These stories are going to blow your mind. So before we jump in, smash that like button if you're ready for some serious historical tea, and subscribe if you want more stories that will make you question everything they taught you in school. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing our global history nerds unite at all hours. Now grab your favourite drink, maybe dim those lights, and let's dive into 3 stories that prove the past was way more savage and brilliant than anyone wants to admit. Trust me, by the end of this, you'll never look at history the same way again. First up, we're heading to ancient China in 690 CE, where Zetian is about to pull off the most audacious power grab in Chinese history. The Keeper of Secrets, Harappan civilization, 2600 BCE. You wake to the sound of water flowing through the carefully engineered drains beneath your feet. The morning sun filters through the precisely cut windows of your brick home in Harappan, casting geometric shadows across the floor. But here's the thing about living in what future archaeologists will call one of humanity's most advanced civilizations. Nobody talks about the pressure. Your name is lost to history, but your job. You're a keeper of the city's most guarded secrets, not the dramatic Hollywood-style secrets involving hidden treasures or political conspiracies. No. You manage something far more crucial, the standardization system that keeps this massive urban experiment from falling apart. Every morning, you walk through streets that would make a Roman city planner weep with envy. The roads are laid out in perfect grids, each block precisely measured. The drainage system, the drainage system, is so sophisticated that it won't be matched for another 1,000 years. Your neighbours live in houses with private wells, indoor plumbing, and standardized brick sizes. It's 2600 BCE, and you're living better than most people will for millennia. But here's what the history books won't tell you. Maintaining this level of organisation is absolutely exhausting. You carry a leather satchel filled with standardized weights and measures, small, precisely carved stones that ensure every merchant in the Indus Valley uses the same system. A gram in Harappa equals a gram in Mohenjo-Daro, 300 miles away. This isn't just bureaucratic obsession, it's the backbone of a trade network that spans from Afghanistan to Gujarat. The first stop is the Great Bath, that massive waterproof structure that archaeologists will spend decades arguing about. Is it religious, practical, both? You know the answer, because you helped design the ritual purification schedule. Every morning citizens gather here, not just for spiritual cleansing, but for the daily recitation of standardized procedures. The water temperature, the duration of bathing, the order of entry, everything is regulated. Another beautiful day in paradise, mutters Kesh, your assistant, as he struggles with a particularly stubborn bronze scale. The sarcasm is thick enough to cut with a standardized knife. Kesh is what you'd call a millennial of the Bronze Age, talented, frustrated, and convinced that the previous generation had it easier. The Mesopotamians don't have indoor plumbing, you remind him, checking off items on your clay tablet. The Egyptians are still figuring out how to move massive stone blocks. We've solved urban planning. Sure, but have we solved happiness? Kesh retorts, and you have to admit he has a point. The truth is, life in Harappa is a constant balance between innovation and control. Your civilization has achieved something remarkable, a completely egalitarian society with no apparent kings, no monumental palaces, no obvious class distinctions. Archaeological evidence suggests that wealth was relatively evenly distributed. Houses were similarly sized, and even the fancy jewellery was accessible to most citizens. But this equality comes with a price. Every decision requires consensus. Every innovation must be approved by the council. Every change to the standardization system requires months of debate and implementation across dozens of cities. You've created a society so perfectly organized that it's almost impossible to adapt quickly to new challenges. Your second stop is the marketplace, where the real drama unfolds. Merchants from as far as Central Asia come here to trade, and your job is to ensure they understand the system. The Harappan script, those mysterious symbols carved into seals and pottery, isn't just decorative. It's a complex administrative language that tracks everything from grain shipments to pottery production quotas. This weight is off by 3 standard units you tell a visiting trader from the western reaches of the empire. He's trying to pass off slightly heavier stones as standard weights, probably hoping to skim a little profit from his transactions. The trader shrugs, not particularly concerned. It's close enough. Close enough is a phrase that doesn't exist in Harappan. Your entire civilization runs on precision. Close enough is how civilizations collapse. You spend the morning recalibrating scales, checking measurements, and updating inventory records. It's tedious work, but you understand something that future historians will struggle to grasp. This tedium is what makes complex society possible. Every successful civilization needs its bureaucrats, its record keepers, its obsessive organizers. By midday, the heat is becoming oppressive. The summer monsoons are late this year, something that's been happening more frequently. You notice things others miss. The slight decrease in water levels in the wells, the way farmers' faces tighten when they discuss crop yields, the subtle changes in trade patterns as resources become scarcer. Climate change, though you wouldn't call it that, is slowly strangling your civilization. The Indus River, which has sustained your people for generations, is shifting its course. Rainfall patterns are becoming unpredictable. The elaborate water management systems that made urban life possible are struggling to adapt. You've brought these concerns to the council multiple times, but here's the problem with consensus-based governance. It's really hard to make dramatic changes quickly. Every proposal must be debated, standardized, and implemented across the entire civilization. By the time you finish discussing modifications to the water management system, the crisis has already begun. The afternoon is spent in the pottery district, where artisans create the beautiful ceramics that will survive long after everything else crumbles. You're checking the standardization of pottery designs, not for aesthetic reasons, but because consistent pottery sizes indicate consistent measurement systems, which indicate a functioning administrative state. The designs are getting more elaborate, notes Mira, the head potter. She's one of the few people who understands the bigger picture. More artistic freedom, less standardization. You nod, making notes. This is actually a warning sign. When administrative control begins to weaken, art becomes more individualistic. It's beautiful, but it's also evidence of social fragmentation. The evening brings the day's most important task, updating the master records. In a sealed room beneath the city's administrative centre, you maintain the comprehensive documentation system that coordinates the entire Harappan civilization. Population counts, resource allocations, trade agreements, technological innovations, everything is recorded in your precise script. Future archaeologists will be frustrated by their inability to decode this script completely. They'll create elaborate theories about lost languages and mysterious civilizations. The truth is both simpler and more complex. Your writing system is so specialized, so focused on administrative efficiency, that it's nearly impossible to understand without the cultural context. You're not recording epic poetry or religious text, you're documenting the daily operation of humanity's first truly urban civilization. It's incredibly sophisticated and utterly practical, which makes it boring to people who expect ancient civilizations to be mysterious and exotic. As you work late into the night, updating trade figures and resource allocation charts, you can't shake the feeling that you're documenting the end of something. The signs are everywhere: decreased trade volume, increased migration from rural areas, subtle changes in standardization compliance. Your perfect society is slowly coming apart. But here's what you understand that history will forget. The Harappan civilization doesn't collapse in a dramatic explosion of war or natural disaster. It gradually transforms, adapts, and evolves. The people don't disappear, they migrate, intermarry, and carry their knowledge to new communities. The administrative systems you've spent your life perfecting become the foundation for future civilizations. The standardized weights and measures, they'll influence trade systems across South Asia for centuries. The urban planning principles, they'll reappear in later Indian cities. The egalitarian social structure, it'll inspire political philosophers who haven't been born yet. You close your tablets, seal the records, and step outside into the perfectly planned streets of Harappa. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new problems to solve, new standards to maintain. The work never ends, but that's okay. You're not just keeping records, you're building the foundation of human civilization. The legacy of the Harappan civilization isn't found in monuments or royal tombs. It's found in the idea that humans can live together in large, complex societies, without exploitation, without massive inequality, without sacrificing individual dignity to collective power. It's found in the understanding that true civilization isn't about impressive architecture or military conquest. It's about creating systems that allow people to flourish. And maybe, just maybe, that's a secret worth keeping. The Scholar Who Saved China. Tang Dynasty, 690 CE. Zetian is drunk on power, literally and figuratively, and you're about to witness history's most audacious political maneuver. But first, let's talk about the woman who's orchestrating it all, and why everything you think you know about medieval China is probably wrong. Your name is Kong Xianji, and you're a court scholar during what should be the golden age of the Tang Dynasty. Should be, because right now, in 690 CE, you're watching the only woman in Chinese history seize absolute imperial power. And honestly, you're not sure if you should be terrified or impressed. The morning starts like any other at the Imperial Palace in Luoyang. You're reviewing historical precedents for the Empress Dowager's latest political innovations, a euphemistic way of saying you're helping her justify why traditional Chinese governance is complete garbage and needs to be revolutionized. Your job, officially, is to provide scholarly legitimacy to her reforms. Your job, unofficially, is to help her become the most powerful ruler in Chinese history without triggering a civil war. No pressure. Scholar Kong, comes the voice of Shangguan Wana, Zetian's chief secretary and quite possibly the most brilliant woman you've ever met. She's barely 30, but she's already revolutionizing Chinese literature and administration. The Empress requires your assessment of the Buddhist legitimacy documents. You follow her through corridors that are simultaneously opulent and tasteful, a combination that should be impossible, but somehow works. The Tang Dynasty is having a moment culturally speaking. Poetry is flourishing, trade is booming, and the capital cities are the most cosmopolitan places on earth. Chang'an, the primary capital, has over 1 million residents and welcomes merchants from Persia, Central Asia, and the Mediterranean. But here's what the history books often miss. All this cultural flowering is happening under the rule of a woman who's been systematically dismantling every traditional Chinese assumption about power, gender, and legitimacy. And somehow, it's working. Wu Zetian, born Wu Zhao, former concubine, current Empress Dowager, and future Emperor, yes, Emperor, not Empress, is in her mid-60s and at the height of her political powers. She spent decades manoeuvring through court intrigue, eliminating rivals, and accumulating authority. Today, she's about to declare herself the founder of a new dynasty. The Buddhist texts are creative, you tell Shangguan Wana diplomatically. Wu Zetian has commissioned scholars to discover prophecies that predict the rise of a female Buddha-like figure who will rule China and bring about a golden age. It's religious propaganda, but it's also theologically sophisticated propaganda. Creative enough to convince the population that heaven mandates female rule, Shangguan asks. Creative enough to make it plausible, you reply, which is about as close to endorsement as you're comfortable giving. The truth is, Wu Zetian's rise to power is both exactly what you'd expect from Chinese court politics and completely unprecedented. She's used every traditional method of gaining influence: strategic marriages, elimination of rivals, bureaucratic manipulation, but she's applied them to achieve something no woman in Chinese history has ever attempted. You enter the main audience hall, where Wu Zetian is holding court. She's smaller than you expected when you first met her years ago, but her presence fills the room. She's dressed in imperial yellow, wearing the full regalia of supreme power, and she's surrounded by officials who are either completely loyal or completely terrified, often both. "Scholar Kong," she says, and her voice carries the particular authority of someone who has spent decades learning to command attention. "I trust you've completed your analysis of the historical precedents. This is the moment you've been dreading. Zetian wants you to provide scholarly justification for her claim to imperial authority, not just as regent or empress dowager, but as emperor. She wants to found her own dynasty, the Zhou, and rule in her own name. Your Majesty," you begin, choosing your words carefully. The historical precedents are complex. Zetian's smile is sharp enough to cut silk. "Complex how?" "There are no direct precedents for female imperial rule in Chinese history," you say, stating the obvious. "However, the principles of governance outlined in the classical texts focus on virtue, wisdom, and the mandate of heaven rather than gender." It's a careful answer, but it's also true. The Confucian classics, which form the foundation of Chinese political theory, are surprisingly flexible on this point. They emphasize moral authority over traditional hierarchy, which gives Zetian a theoretical opening. "And what of the Buddhist prophecies?" she asks. This is where things get interesting. Zetian has been patronizing Buddhist monasteries and scholars for decades, not just out of personal belief, but as a political strategy. Buddhism, unlike Confucianism, has strong traditions of female spiritual authority. By positioning herself as a Buddhist ruler, she's drawing on a different source of legitimacy. The prophecies are remarkably specific, you say. They speak of a golden age under the rule of a female bodhisattva who will unite China and extend its influence across Asia. Zetian nods. "And do you believe these prophecies are authentic?" Here's where your job becomes dangerous. You know these prophecies were commissioned by Zetian's supporters. They're about as authentic as a $3 bill, but they're also brilliantly crafted, theologically sophisticated, and politically effective. "I believe," you say carefully, "that their authenticity is less important than their truth." It's a philosophical dodge, but Zetian appreciates philosophical dodges. She spent her entire career navigating the gap between appearance and reality, between traditional expectations and practical necessity. The rest of the morning is spent in policy discussions that would make modern political scientists weep with envy. Zetian isn't just seizing power, she's systematically reforming Chinese governance. She's expanded the civil service examination system, promoted officials based on merit rather than family connections, and created new government departments focused on agriculture, commerce, and public works. "The traditional aristocracy is resistant," reports Li Jiaode, one of Zetian's most trusted advisors. They argue that these reforms undermine social stability. Zetian laughs, and it's not a pleasant sound. "Social stability? They mean their own privilege. How stable is a society that wastes half its talent because of arbitrary gender restrictions?" She has a point. The Tang dynasty is succeeding precisely because it's more meritocratic than previous Chinese dynasties. Zetian has appointed talented administrators regardless of their background, promoted trade and commerce, and encouraged cultural innovation. The results speak for themselves. China is prosperous, powerful, and culturally vibrant. But there's a cost to all this success. Zetian's rise to power has been marked by what historians will politely call political eliminations. She's had rivals executed, family members exiled, and potential threats neutralized. The traditional Chinese historical accounts will paint her as a ruthless tyrant who destroyed the imperial family and ruled through fear. These accounts aren't entirely wrong, but they're incomplete. Zetian operates in a political system where survival requires ruthlessness. Male emperors who eliminate rivals are described as decisive. Female rulers who do the same thing are called bloodthirsty. The double standard is so obvious it's almost comical. The afternoon brings news from the frontier provinces. Chinese armies are expanding into Central Asia. trade with the Silk Road is booming, and diplomatic missions are arriving from as far as the Byzantine Empire. Under Wu Zetian's rule, China is becoming the dominant power in East Asia. The Tibetans are requesting a marriage alliance, reports General Guo Yuanzhen. They want to marry one of their princes to a Tang princess. Wu Zetian considers this. Marriage alliances are standard diplomatic tools, but they're also opportunities for rival factions to gain influence. She's particularly suspicious of any arrangement that might strengthen the traditional aristocracy. Counter-proposal, she says, we'll send a delegation to discuss trade agreements. No marriage, but we'll offer them preferential access to Chinese markets. It's a typically Wu Zetian solution. Practical, profitable, and politically safe. She's not interested in romantic diplomacy. She's interested in results. As the day progresses, you begin to understand something that history will struggle to appreciate. Wu Zetian isn't just a female ruler operating in a male-dominated system. She's a transformative leader who's using her gender as a political tool. By breaking the ultimate taboo, female imperial rule, she's freed herself from all the other traditional constraints. Male emperors have to respect certain conventions, maintain certain relationships, and operate within certain boundaries. Wu Zetian, having already violated the most fundamental rule, can remake the entire system. It's political jiu-jitsu at its finest. The evening brings the formal ceremony that will change Chinese history. Wu Zetian is declaring herself Emperor of the Zhou dynasty, officially ending the Tang dynasty and establishing herself as the sole ruler of China. The ceremony is held in the newly constructed Hall of Light, a massive octagonal building that represents the cosmic order. By the mandate of heaven and the will of the people, Wu Zetian declares, I assume the title of emperor and establish the Zhou dynasty. The assembled officials kowtow, but you notice the subtle gradations of enthusiasm. Some are genuinely supportive, others are pragmatically accepting, and a few are clearly terrified. Wu Zetian notices too. She notices everything. Later, as the celebration continues, you find yourself in conversation with Shangguan Wana. She's been drinking, carefully because she never loses control, but enough to be more candid than usual. Do you think she'll succeed? Shangguan asks. Define success, you reply. Will the Zhou dynasty survive her death? It's a good question. Wu Zetian has achieved something unprecedented, but she's also created a system that depends entirely on her personal authority. When she dies, will her innovations survive, or will China revert to traditional patterns? She's changed the conversation, you say. Even if the Zhou dynasty doesn't survive, the precedent will. Future Chinese history will have to account for the fact that a woman once ruled as emperor. Shangguan nods. And the reforms? The merit-based bureaucracy, the expanded civil service, the commercial policies, those are too successful to abandon completely. The next dynasty will keep what works and discard what doesn't. As the evening winds down, you reflect on what you've witnessed. Wu Zetian's reign will last another 15 years, and she'll die peacefully in her bed, something that's remarkably rare for Chinese rulers. Her Zhou dynasty will end with her death, but the Tang dynasty that follows will incorporate many of her innovations. The historical verdict on Wu Zetian will be complex and contradictory. Traditional Chinese historians will condemn her as a usurper who violated natural order. Modern historians will praise her as a pioneering feminist who broke gender barriers. Both perspectives miss the point. Wu Zetian succeeded because she understood power better than anyone of her generation. She recognized that legitimacy comes not from tradition or gender or family connections, but from effectiveness. She made China prosperous, powerful, and culturally vibrant. Everything else was just details. Her legacy isn't found in gender politics or feminist theory. It's found in the idea that leadership is about results, not pedigree. It's found in the understanding that societies that waste talent for any reason are societies that fail. It's found in the recognition that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is simply be excellent at your job. And maybe, just maybe, that's a lesson worth remembering. The Lioness of Ndongo, West Central Africa, 1624. Queen Nzinga of Ndongo is about to negotiate with the Portuguese, and you're fairly certain someone is going to die before this meeting is over. The question is whether it will be metaphorical or literal, and honestly, given Nzinga's reputation, you're not taking any bets. Your name is Kafuxi, and you're what the Portuguese would call a translator, and what your people would call a cultural bridge builder. It's 1624, and you're standing in the courtyard of the Portuguese governor's residence in Luanda, watching the most formidable woman in West Central Africa prepare to do something that will either save her kingdom or destroy it completely. The morning started before dawn with Nzinga's war council. She's been preparing for this negotiation for months, and every detail has been planned with military precision. The Queen of Ndongo doesn't do anything casually, especially not when dealing with the Portuguese slave traders, who have been systematically destroying her region for the past century. Remember, she told her advisors, we're not here to beg, we're here to negotiate terms between equals. The advisors nodded, but you could see the skepticism in their eyes. How do you negotiate as equals with people who have spent generations treating Africans as property? How do you find common ground with a colonial power that sees your entire continent as a resource to be extracted? Nzinga has an answer to this question, and it's typically audacious. You don't acknowledge their superiority in the first place. The Portuguese governor, João Correia de Sousa, is waiting in his formal reception chamber. He's arranged the room in classic colonial style: elevated chair for himself, simple stools for African visitors, symbolic arrangements designed to reinforce hierarchy. It's political theatre, but it's also psychological warfare. Nzinga enters with her full retinue, and the temperature in the room immediately drops. She's in her 40s, at the height of her political powers, and she carries herself with the confidence of someone who has never lost a negotiation. Her clothing is a masterful blend of African and European elements, traditional Mabundu royal regalia, combined with Portuguese silk and jewellery. She's making a statement about adaptation and sovereignty simultaneously. The governor gestures toward the stools. Your Majesty may be seated. Nzinga looks at the stools, then at the governor's elevated chair, then back at the stools. The silence stretches for what feels like hours, but is probably only seconds. Then, with a gesture that will be remembered for centuries, she snaps her fingers. One of her attendants immediately drops to hands and knees, forming a human chair. Nzinga sits gracefully, maintaining perfect eye contact with the governor. She's now at exactly the same height as the Portuguese official, and she's done it without accepting his definition of the situation. Governor Correia de Sousa, she says, her voice carrying the particular authority of someone who has spent decades commanding respect. I am pleased to meet with you as one sovereign to another. The governor's face is a masterpiece of controlled irritation. He's been outmaneuvered before the negotiation even begins, and everyone in the room knows it. You have to admire the strategic brilliance. Nzinga has refused to be diminished, while simultaneously demonstrating her power over her own people. Your Majesty, the governor replies, emphasizing the title with just enough sarcasm to be insulting. I trust you understand why we've requested this meeting. Here's where your job becomes crucial. You're not just translating languages, you're translating worldviews. The Portuguese see this as a discussion between a European colonial power and a local African ruler. Nzinga sees it as a negotiation between two sovereign nations. The difference in perspective is everything. The governor wishes to discuss the current difficulties regarding trade and territorial boundaries, you translate, carefully choosing words that acknowledge Portuguese concerns without accepting Portuguese authority. Nzinga nods. Please tell the governor that the Kingdom of Ndongo is always interested in peaceful trade relationships with foreign powers, provided such relationships are based on mutual respect and mutual benefit. The translation is diplomatic, but the message is clear. Nzinga is not accepting vassal status. She's positioning Ndongo as an independent kingdom that chooses its trading partners, not a territory that submits to Portuguese authority. The governor's response is predictable. He launches into a lengthy explanation of Portuguese claims to the region, backed by papal authority and military power. It's the standard colonial justification. European Christians have a divine right to rule over African pagans. and resistance is both futile and morally wrong. Nzinga listens patiently, but you can see the calculation in her eyes. She's not just hearing the words, she's analysing the psychology behind them. The Portuguese need to believe their own propaganda about racial and religious superiority. That need is a weakness she can exploit. The governor speaks of papal authority, she says, when he finishes. Perhaps he has forgotten that the kingdom of Ndongo converted to Christianity decades ago. My brother was baptized as a Christian king. I myself am prepared to accept baptism if it will facilitate peaceful relations. It's a brilliant move. By offering to convert to Christianity, Nzinga is removing the Portuguese religious justification for conquest, while simultaneously demonstrating her willingness to adapt to changing circumstances. But she's also doing something subtler. She's forcing the Portuguese to acknowledge that their real interest is economic and political, not religious. The governor shifts uncomfortably. Your Majesty's willingness to embrace the true faith is commendable. However, the question remains of Portuguese territorial claims and the need for stable governance in the region. Stable governance, Nzinga repeats, and there's just enough edge in her voice to make it clear she understands exactly what he means. Perhaps the governor could explain how the slave trade contributes to regional stability. And there it is, the elephant in the room. The Portuguese presence in West Central Africa isn't about governance or Christianity or civilization, it's about slavery. They need a steady supply of enslaved people to work their plantations in Brazil, and they need compliant local rulers to help them acquire that supply. Nzinga's kingdom has been caught in the middle of this system for decades. Portuguese slave traders have been raiding her territory, Portuguese allies have been attacking her neighbours, and Portuguese politics have been destabilising the entire region. She's here to negotiate an end to these practices, but she's also here to demonstrate that Ndongo won't be bullied into submission. The slave trade, the governor says carefully, is a legitimate commercial enterprise that benefits all parties. African rulers receive valuable European goods in exchange for prisoners of war and criminals. European colonies receive necessary labour. The enslaved individuals receive Christian education and the opportunity for salvation. It's such a complete distortion of reality that you almost admire the audacity. The Portuguese have convinced themselves that slavery is actually beneficial to its victims. It's the kind of cognitive dissonance that makes colonialism psychologically possible. Nzinga's response is measured but devastating. The governor's description is interesting. However, in my experience, the individuals being enslaved are rarely prisoners of war or criminals. They are farmers, craftsmen, mothers and children who have been kidnapped from their homes and sold into lifelong bondage. Perhaps the governor has been misinformed about the nature of this trade. The accusation hangs in the air like smoke. Nzinga is calling the Portuguese system exactly what it is: organised kidnapping on a massive scale. She's doing it diplomatically, but she's also doing it clearly enough that there's no possibility of misunderstanding. The rest of the morning is spent in detailed negotiations about territorial boundaries, trade agreements and military alliances. It's complex technical work that requires careful attention to language and precedent. You're translating not just words, but entire legal and political concepts. Nzinga demonstrates a mastery of European diplomatic conventions that clearly surprises the Portuguese. She references international law, cites precedents from other Portuguese colonies, and proposes solutions that would be reasonable if both parties were actually negotiating in good faith. But here's what makes this negotiation historically significant. Nzinga isn't just defending her kingdom. She's articulating a vision of African sovereignty that will influence resistance movements for centuries. She's arguing that African rulers have the same rights as European monarchs, that African kingdoms deserve the same respect as European nations, and that African people are entitled to the same freedoms as European citizens. These aren't radical ideas in the abstract, but they're revolutionary in the context of early 17th century colonialism. European powers have built their entire imperial system on the assumption that Africans are naturally inferior and that African societies are inherently primitive. Nzinga's mere presence at this negotiation challenges those assumptions. The afternoon brings discussions of military matters. The Portuguese want Nzinga's help in suppressing resistance movements in neighbouring kingdoms. They want her to provide troops for their slave raids. They want her to accept Portuguese military advisors and Portuguese administrative oversight. Nzinga's response is characteristically direct. The Kingdom of Ndongo maintains its own military forces for the defence of its own territory. We have no interest in attacking our neighbours on behalf of foreign powers. It's a polite way of saying absolutely not, but it's also a statement of military independence. Nzinga is making it clear that her kingdom will not become a Portuguese client state. The governor's frustration is becoming visible. He's expected this to be a simple submission ceremony. African ruler acknowledges Portuguese authority, accepts Portuguese terms, and agrees to Portuguese supervision. Instead, he's getting a complex international negotiation with a leader who clearly considers herself his equal. "Your Majesty," he says, his diplomatic facade beginning to crack, "I must remind you that Portugal has significant military resources in this region. It would be unfortunate if diplomatic solutions proved impossible." It's a threat, barely disguised as a warning. Nzinga's response is immediate and devastating. "Governor," she says, rising from her human chair, "I must remind you that the Kingdom of Ndongo has been defending itself against foreign invasion for over a century. We have considerable experience with military solutions." She stands there for a moment, letting the implications sink in. Then with perfect diplomatic courtesy, she continues, "However, we naturally prefer peaceful resolutions to regional conflicts. Perhaps we should consider more creative approaches to our mutual concerns." What follows is the most remarkable diplomatic performance you've ever witnessed. Nzinga proposes a series of compromises that would protect her kingdom's sovereignty while giving the Portuguese some of what they want. She offers to regulate the slave trade rather than eliminate it, to provide military assistance against common enemies rather than Portuguese rivals, and to accept Portuguese advisors rather than Portuguese administrators. It's a masterful negotiation strategy. Give ground on practical matters while maintaining principle on fundamental issues. The Portuguese get some immediate benefits, but they don't get the complete submission they're seeking. The governor is clearly conflicted. Nzinga's proposals are reasonable, but they don't fit the colonial model he's been instructed to implement. He needs to report back to his superiors that he's established Portuguese authority over the region, not that he's negotiated a treaty with an independent African kingdom. By evening, it's clear that no final agreement will be reached today. Both sides need time to consider the proposals and consult with their respective authorities, but the negotiation has accomplished something more important than immediate resolution. It's established Nzinga as a legitimate international player. As the formal session concludes, you find yourself walking back through Luanda with Nzinga's retinue. The city is a fascinating and disturbing mixture of African and European elements. Portuguese colonial architecture, built with African labour, European merchants selling goods produced by African craftsmen, and everywhere the underlying reality of the slave trade that makes it all possible. "What do you think?" Nzinga asks as you walk. "I think," you reply carefully, "that you've changed the terms of the conversation. The Portuguese came here expecting submission and got negotiation instead." Nzinga nods. "And what do you think will happen next?" That's the million-dollar question. The Portuguese will likely reject her proposals and attempt to impose their will by force. Nzinga will resist, probably successfully in the short term. The conflict will continue for decades, with neither side achieving complete victory. But something fundamental has shifted. By refusing to accept Portuguese definitions of the situation, by negotiating as an equal rather than begging as a subordinate, Nzinga has demonstrated that African resistance is possible. She's shown that European colonialism isn't inevitable, that African sovereignty isn't obsolete, and that the relationship between Europe and Africa can be renegotiated. The historical record will show that Nzinga's resistance was ultimately unsuccessful in the narrow sense. The Portuguese did eventually establish control over much of her territory. But in the broader sense, her example will inspire generations of African leaders who refuse to accept colonial subordination. Her legacy isn't found in military victories or diplomatic treaties. It's found in the idea that African leaders have the right to determine their own destiny, that African kingdoms deserve international respect, and that African people are entitled to freedom and dignity. And maybe, just maybe, that's a lesson the world is still learning. These three narratives, spanning over 2 millennia and 3 continents, reveal the complex reality behind simplified historical accounts. The unnamed bureaucrat of Harappa understood that civilization requires constant maintenance and adaptation. Zetian demonstrated that effective leadership transcends traditional categories and expectations. Queen Nzinga proved that dignity and sovereignty cannot be negotiated away, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Each figure operated within systems that sought to limit their agency: urban complexity, gender restrictions, and colonial oppression, respectively. Their responses reveal both the possibilities and constraints of their historical moments. They remind us that the past was inhabited by real people facing real challenges, not by the cardboard figures of simplified historical narratives. Their stories continue to resonate because they address fundamental questions about human organization, leadership, and resistance that remain relevant today. In an age of global connectivity and rapid change, we might learn something from the Harappan commitment to standardization and equality, Zetian's pragmatic approach to institutional reform, and Nzinga's refusal to accept diminished status. History, it turns out, is not a collection of dusty facts, but a repository of human wisdom, folly, and resilience. These figures succeeded not because they were perfect, but because they understood their circumstances and adapted accordingly. Their successes and failures offer lessons for anyone trying to navigate complex systems, challenge established hierarchies, or build something lasting in an uncertain world.